I'm sure that many of you will have watched aghast at the violence of August 2005 riots in Jakarta. Despite significant spend with influencers, Jakarta really isn't a tourist destination, unlike Bali, and lacks the tourist infrastructure of cities like Bangkok or even Jogja. Nevertheless, perhaps some of you have considered at least a few days in Jakarta and wondered if it's safe to visit. I want to assure you that Jakarta is perfectly safe. Indeed, it's much safer than cities like Pretoria, Caracas, Port Moresby, Johannesburg, Durban, Pedro Sula and Memphis. In fact, Jakarta is no more dangerous than Miami or Pheonix, despite being significantly larger. Given Indonesia's successful diplomatic intervention in the Isreal Palestine conflict, I should also mention that Jakarta is far safer than Gaza, and feels more so than Jerusalem, despite its reputedly low crime rate. Nevertheless, visitors should take some precautions, as locals are all too willing to advise them. In fact, advising foreign visitors to take care, and how to, is something of a national pastime for Indonesians. It is these basic safety precautions that will be the focus of my vlog. Indonesians have a reputation for being very welcoming towards visitors, which is completely true. What is less known is that, in common with much of Asia, they're quite racist, ranking around 14th in the world, and you will be discriminated against simply because you're not Indonesians. Indonesians don't recognise this themselves and simply see it as human nature. Indeed, should you mention it, you will be seen as somewhat provocative. At its simplest, this will involve paying far more than locals for almost everything. But should you need to interact with government, I've heard that you could be exposed to a rather nasty face of corruption. Now, I've never come across this myself, and suspect that these are simply malicious rumours spread by jealous neighbours. Such practices are informed by the myth all Indonesians are taught as children, that someone will come from the sky to make them very rich. To avoid becoming targets, many people fly to Singapore's Changi airport and then take the ferry to Batam Island prior to flying to their ultimate destination within Indonesia. I've no idea if this precaution works, but it's becoming increasingly popular, especially amongst Russians. The myth may expose you to often sophisticated and sometimes bizarre fraud plans, for some reason often involving printed proposals. But once uncovered, the perpetrators all too often become angry that you have spoilt their birthright to become wealthy beyond imagination. In fact, this is often the flashpoint in those few misunderstandings which occur between overseas visitors and Indonesians. Like most of the world, Jakarta becomes significantly less safe after dark, and some streets can be very dark indeed. In particular, Menteng in central Jakarta and Kemang and Pondok Indah in south Jakarta are notorious hotbeds of crime and vice, fueled by the crushing poverty prevalent in these districts. Indeed, the notorious gang known as Guru Jis are said to rule Pondok Indah with an iron fist. Fueled by alcohol, Jakarta's youth cause mayhem at night time, especially the sons and daughters of wealthy Jakartans who race and frequently crash supercars on its streets whilst intoxicated. Less upmarket version of this is drunk youths racing small motorcycles and scooters on streets and all too often on pavements. In common with other parts of Asia, young, scantily dressed girls can be found collapsed on the street, presumably sleeping on the pavement until the alcohol wears off or the morning. Given the abundance of vulnerable young girls on the streets, female visitors are probably much safer in Jakarta than other large cities. Although I have heard what are probably urban myths of foreign ladies being taken from the streets of Jakarta to Gunung Kemukus. More on that later. Narcotics may be less prevalent than in the West, but there is an underlying level of addiction to narcotics and alcohol, which often drives opportunist crime, including the somewhat rare muggings, which do occasionally occur. Nevertheless, in certain parts of Jakarta, young people may be encountered at night, clearly under the influence of something quite powerful. Having said this, the authorities have done much to clean up Jakarta's image. And if you stick to the central areas, you're most unlikely to encounter anything I have described. And there's a term for Indonesian organised crime gangs, encompassing street-level criminals up through crime bosses and allegedly into the highest strata of Indonesian society. Pre-men are often perceived negatively throughout Indonesian society due to associations with violence and crime. Nevertheless, despite the prevalence of pre-men, all crime in Indonesia is blamed on foreigners, especially the Dutch and the Chinese. The root word is derived from a term which describes the convergence of state power and criminality. However, organised crime in India has a complicated history, as the confluence of crime gangs with perceived legitimate political authority has a history extending as far back as the Mataram Kingdom, not least as Javanese etiquette prevented the nobility from directly exercising power. Indeed, whilst associated with brigandage and theft, Indonesian crime gangs have periodically acted as enforcers to maintain authority and order, such as during the Japanese occupation and during the fight for independence. The role of the Jago or Jawara was particularly important during the Indonesian Revolution, as they often adopted political roles and helped consolidating the power of local authorities. Despite their significance to Indonesian history, gangs are marginalised due to associations with violence and social illegitimacy. The word Jago literally means rooster and refers to a type of strongman that exists as a part of everyday life in urban and rural areas of Indonesia. Those from the north of England will be familiar with the term cock of the class, which is similar. The Jago is a social and political actor in both recent and more distant history of Indonesia. In Indonesian popular culture, Jago is often romanticised as a champion of the people, whose acts of violence are motivated by a deep sense of justice, honour and order. The Preman is the modern, diagonally opposite form of the Jago. The word originated from the Dutch word vreeman, freeman, showing the roots of the social group during the Dutch colonial order. A vreeman was not a freed slave, but rather a non-contract overseer or coolie day labourer, thus still in the employ of the company, though not legally bound to it. The local Preman gangs became institutes, a part of the democratic process, whereby they started to form their own political parties. However, there was also a split in a new breed of Preman organisations. Whilst organisations such as the Patriotic Party, Pemuda Pancasila, continue to portray themselves as defenders of national unity, a new breed organised themselves along post-Pancasila ethnic and religious lines. This new breed includes the Betawi Brotherhood Forum and Front Pembela Islam, no band. In many respects, these new organisations can provide protection to members who are newcomers to the city, like the Rotary Club, but armed with knives and clubs. Some have established themselves as neo-monopolies with the provision of services such as debt collection. Such is the popularity of Bremen culture that local heavy rock music is called Bremen, and former President Jokowi was a big fan of it. Jakarta is characterised by small streets, often inaccessible by cars and known as gangs. This is because these are areas controlled by Bremen gangs and should be avoided by visitors. What are the dangers of entering these gangs? Well, harassment and robbery are rarer than you might think, but kidnapping of tourists or foreigners is not unknown in Indonesia, with kidnappers often demanding ridiculous payments before release. Such practices are known locally as gotong royong, implying that there is something of a national duty to kidnap foreigners. Indeed, much of what I described is blamed on the Dutch by Indonesians themselves. But then the Dutch are an convenient excuse for everything that is wrong with Indonesian society. In Bali, the Dutch are substituted with Australians, and more recently also Russians. Perhaps shockingly, the police themselves have been rumoured to engage in kidnapping. Almost certainly in apocryphal, the rumours that they did exactly this as they arrested rioters in Jakarta in August 2005. Certainly all uniformed forces are available for moonlighting, potentially including for illegal activities. Shocking though kidnapping can be, more so is that there are still rumours of cannibalism within Indonesia. Of course, there is debate amongst anthropologists if cannibalism ever existed and simply represents a colonial slur. But if anywhere can claim to have a tradition of cannibalism, it is Indonesia. Visitors to Indonesia will come across a local curry dish known as rendang. Whilst it can be made of chicken, deer, duck or beef, allegedly the most sought after meat is that of humans from the Netherlands. When the Dutch occupied Indonesia, local people had difficulty in saying the word Rotterdam, and this was simplified to rendang. Given the shortage of visitors from Rotterdam entering Jakarta's gangs, this delicacy is now in short supply. Although there are rumours of frozen meat being stored in illegal cold storage units in Bekasi. Also, meat from Rotterdam is often substituted with that from other cities such as Eindhoven and Utrecht, although any Dutch meat may be used. There are rumours of greedy vendors passing off meat from Belgian nationals as authentically Dutch, with that from Bruges allegedly being indistinguishable from Rotterdam. The same is said of meat from those born from Fremantle, Australia, who are sought after for the Balinese version of rendang. Allegedly unscrupulous Chinese traders, many originating from Manado in Jakarta, have been passing off dog and cat meat as Rotterdam meat. Recently, the Jakarta Post exposed a Bremen gang engaged in the sale of Dutch flesh. A picture of the crime scene included a local police chief pointing at a large cooking pot with a serious expression on his face. Another was a picture of gang members dressed in orange with black balaclavas, looking less than happy. And rather strangely, the Dutch family, also in orange, but maybe understandable as they'd been found naked, although not that they were shackled. A family of 4 from Prince Alexandra were discovered in a gang dwelling, stripped naked and bound, Fortunately, the fire had not been lit and they were saved from their fate. Fenner, 57, said, "This was a close call, and I want to thank the police, Jakarta police and people of Indonesia for saving us from our fate. It hasn't put us off Jakarta and its smiling locals," she said. "We're already planning next year's trip." Let me reassure you that such incidents are extremely rare, as are those concerning black magic, ilmu hitam and foreign visitors. Often this is linked to black magic concerning the acquisition of wealth. Remember the story of someone arriving from the sky to make Indonesians wealthy? Well, it is rumoured that the Pesugian spell is still practised in Jakarta. This involves human sacrifice to appease the spirits and grant wealth to the perpetrator. Again, visitors need to be particularly on guard after dark. A number of foreigners have claimed that the first thing they knew about their impending sacrifice is when they awoke, tied to the top of a long pole, known as a panjat pinang. Apparently, gangs of young boys spot potential sacrifices on the streets of Jakarta, identifying them by crying out "Bule," meaning victim. A Dukan Santet, black magician, then captures the unfortunate victims while dressed as an ondel-ondel. The ondel-ondel is a large puppet-like figure, large enough to contain the Dukan and the captured victim, or sometimes victims. Foreigners awaiting sacrifice on top of the pole are commemorated in the monument Bondaran Hari in central Jakarta. Indeed, it is often the centre of student demonstrations, either approving or disapproving of the practice. Outside Jakarta, there are a number of variants of this Pesugian ritual. Perhaps the most famous occurs on Gunung Kawi near Malang. Here, Dutch tourists are allegedly sacrificed on the mountain, although there are rumours that any Western tourist can be used. If successful, then the tourist becomes one of the monkeys on Gunung Kawi. Even more bizarrely is a ritual at Gunung Kemukus near Solo. Here foreigners are not killed, but forced to engage in depraved sex acts. It is believed to bring untold wealth to any Indonesian lucky enough to capture a foreigner in this way. As I say, much of what I described is pure conjecture, and the vast majority of visitors to Indonesia and Jakarta have a wonderful incident-free time. Please don't let these urban myths put you off from visiting this wonderful, exciting country and city. But do be careful should you hear people shouting "Bule" at you, as you don't want to end up on top of a Panjat Pinang.